So we're going to make a slight shift in direction following the theme of sustainability. We're going to go from sustainable health to sustainable energy. And I'm now going to do my introduction of Bill Colton. And I didn't ask his permission to call him Bill, but I'm going to take my prerogative here. So he's the Vice President of Corporate Strategic Planning for Exxon Mobil Corporation as of February 1st, 2009. In this role, he oversees the corporation's strategic planning activities and the development of its energy outlook, ExxonMobil's assessment of global energy trends. Mr. Colton received his BS degree in chemical engineering from Michigan Technological University in '75, and he joined Exxon Corporation in that same year. His career has been spent in a spectrum of things, both upstream and downstream business throughout Exxon Mobil, including project development, refining, lubes, synthetic fuels, and like everything that Exxon Mobil does. So I'll add as a kind of an extra comment here that Mr. Colton also worked in the finance and planning position, so he has a good view of the entire spectrum of activities. Bill.
Good afternoon, and thanks, Glenn, for that introduction. I have to say this is just a terrific conference, and Alan, let me tell you, your presentation was just inspirational. People like me, even at my tender age, continue to get inspired by space, and as great as my career at ExxonMobil has been, I really wanted to be an astronaut, like every kid of the 60s, and so you gave me hope that maybe I don't have to give up. In about a year, I'm going to retire, so please put my name on that list of people who want to go into space. So now let's kind of get to the business at hand here, which is ExxonMobil's outlook for energy. I'm just delighted to have this opportunity to share with you ExxonMobil's view of the future of energy, looking out to the year 2040, and this is on a global basis. And just to be clear, the reason we do this work every year is for ourselves. This is our foundational piece of work that we use to guide our business plan, to develop our strategies, and to underpin our investment decisions. And as you know, in our industry, a single project can involve investments of billions of dollars, so we have every incentive to get it right. And lastly, I'll say that we have a very sharp focus on the needs of future consumers. And this is kind of business 101. The only way to be successful as a business is to ensure that you meet the needs of future consumers. So you're going to see as we go through this that we have always a sharp focus on what makes sense for consumers of the future. Now, I've talked about why we do the outlook. I just want to introduce one slide about how we do the outlook, and mainly just to emphasize that it is a kind of bottom-up exercise. We look at each of over 100 countries, country by country. Within each country, we look at 15 different demand sectors of the economy, and then within each demand sector, we look at the alternative of up to 20 different sources of energy or fuel types available to consumers. Then, of course, we have to integrate this on a global basis, and so we have to look at trade flows, and we'll talk about that on some of my slides. And last but not least, we have to forecast future technology and future policies. These are both critical to any outlook for the future. And of course, with technology, which I'm sure is interesting to this group, it's not just a matter of where the technology is now, but where we see that technology moving into the future. And policy is also a very significant factor. Governments everywhere in the world have a lot to say about energy policies, and so you very much have to build in not only where those policies are today, but where we see them going in the future. So now I'd like to just start with a kind of begin with the end and show you kind of the wrap-up of the total numbers in terms of where the overall outlook is going. The first trend I want to point out, obviously the most fundamental driver of energy demands in the world is the number of people. And we show the world growing to almost 9 billion people, growing by 1.8 billion by the year 2040. Importantly, we show the world economic output doubling over this period. So right away you can see there's a fairly important trend here, which is the GDP per person is growing quite dramatically. And this is very much a good news story for all these people, because as you know, GDP per person directly links to standards of living, and we'll talk a lot about that. So the question is, with the world economic output doubling, how much more energy do we need to support that growth? And our answer in the outlook is it's about 25% more energy. So right away you can see this is another kind of good news story, mainly because of efficiencies in every sector, and we'll talk about that. And a lot of that enabled by technology is helping us to generate more GDP with the same amount of energy through energy efficiency, which is really quite important. Now, people are very concerned about the level of CO2 emissions in the world, and so we show emissions peaking about by 2030 or so and then beginning to slightly decline. Now, I want you to note, too, when you look at CO2 emissions declining, not growing even as fast as energy, what that means, if you look at the amount of CO2 per unit of economic output, it's going down by almost a factor of 50%. So this is another kind of good news part of the energy outlook. So that kind of wraps up the kind of bottom line, and now we're going to go through each one of the sectors. Now, I have to tell you, I really love talking to a group like this, scientists and engineers, because numbers speak to you. And I'm going to provide a very number-intensive presentation. Now, my public affairs people are always critical of me in this. They say, Bill, you just show everybody your data, and you expect they're going to get all the messages. And so they have kind of coached me to make sure I try to at least introduce some themes along the way, and I'll try to do that. So I have this one chart that maybe kind of lists the chapters, if you will, I'm going to address as we go through this today. Number one, that energy is fundamental to standards of living everywhere in the world. Second, you're going to see that developing nations lead the gains in both GDP and living standards. Both economics and policies impact the energy mix or the types of energy that make sense for the future. That oil remains the world's primary energy fuel through 2040. But natural gas grows more than any other energy source. And then lastly, that technology has the highest potential to improve the outlook and also introduces the greatest uncertainty in any forecast. So with that, I'd like to start again talking about standards of living. I've talked already about how the world population is growing to about 9 billion people. I want to also emphasize here, and I'm sure it's no surprise to this group, I've made the distinction here between the OECD or developed countries like the US, Europe, and Japan, and non-OECD countries, developing countries like China and India. And I'm going to use this same nomenclature as we go through here. And obviously, most of the people in the world today are in developing countries. But you see the enormous growth, and essentially all of the growth is in these developing economies. And this is quite critical to the way the energy outlook is developed and the conclusions that come from that. Now, I know this is very simplistic, but it kind of helps to get your mind around how to think about energy trends. Is remember, again, the most fundamental driver is the number of people in the world, but then you also want to look at the living standards for those people, because obviously as living standards improve, people use more energy. So when you're looking at the demand for energy in total, you have to consider both of these factors. Now, just to focus on living standards, this map here shows in a 2015 base year, this is showing economic output per person, per capita, with the richer countries, if you will, in blue and the developing countries in red. And you can see the scale on the bottom left. Now I'm going to click to go to 2040, and you can see the transformation of the world in terms of GDP per person. And by the way, this is real GDP. So these are significant improvements in economic conditions for these people. And in fact, one way to think about this is the number of people who move into the middle class, which we show with the data to the right. And you can see here in the developed countries, we have almost 1 billion people today that are in the middle class, and that stays about the same in the future. But you see this enormous growth in the number of people in the middle class in these developing economies. And this is quite striking. Just China and India alone each have a growth of 1 billion people moving into the middle class. And this becomes important because people use more energy as they move into the middle class. Now, another way to look at this shows you a correlation between the UN Human Development Index, which is shown on the left, and on the bottom scale, note that we have energy use per capita, per person. And please notice that scale is a logarithmic scale. So for each measure, it's going up by a factor of 10. And of course, it's not surprising to see that as human development improves, people use more energy. Now, this is quite significant. We're talking about the improvement in the lives of billions of people. And just to give you a couple of statistics, Today, 1.2 billion people in the world have no access to electricity whatsoever. 2.7 billion people cook with charcoal, with wood, or even dung. They have no access to modern cooking fuels. And I always say that this is kind of the easiest part of the energy outlook to explain, which is that people everywhere in the world all seek the same things. They want a warm, secure home. They want clean cooking fuels. They want a refrigerator. They would like to have a TV, a cell phone, and someday even a car. And of course, these are all good things, but they all require energy. Now, as we continue our theme of looking at GDP and GDP per person, this slide just shows the total economic output for the world. And again, you see this emerging trend of the OECD becoming less of a share of the total economic output. Although please notice that both the OECD and the non-OECD countries continue to expand. And so again, this GDP per person is really improving just about everywhere. If you look at the growth and break it down, of course, you see much higher growth rates in the developing world. And you can see, for instance, the significant growth in China and India over this period. So you can see in developing any energy outlook, you have to look very closely at what's happening in the developing world. Now, if we just look at economic output, this would show the amount of energy the world would need if it just tracked GDP growth. Just like GDP, you'd need twice as much energy in the future. But as I mentioned to you before, in fact, our energy outlook would say we only need 25% more energy in the future. And of course, this is because of energy savings through efficiency. And the fact is, this is a huge factor in the outlook. And it's why we often say that the greatest source for energy in the future is simply learning how to use energy more efficiently. People don't think about efficiency as a big factor, but we see it in almost every segment, and it's really critically important to achieve this kind of result. And when you look and break down the energy demand in the future, based on what I told you earlier about the developed and developing country difference, you can see this is almost what I call a tale of two worlds here when you think about energy. Starting first with the blue section for developed countries, please note we're showing almost absolutely flat energy demand. And this is really quite an incredible accomplishment that these developed countries like the US and Europe will continue to expand their economies, but they will not need more energy. Again, this is quite an accomplishment enabled by technology. So all of the growth is in the developing countries. They too will enjoy the benefits of efficiencies, but because their economies are expanding at such a high pace, they will need more energy. And to the right, we just break down the growth in energy from the base year to 2040, and again, just reinforcing that all of the growth in energy demand is in places like India, China, and other developing countries. Now, the next theme I want to address is that both economics and policies impact the energy mix. Obviously, in a lot of industries, people are looking mainly at just consumer economics, but in our industry, you always have to look at the overlay of policies. And there's lots of reasons that countries have energy policies, and probably the most prominent challenge that countries are trying to address now are the risk of climate change. And we're going to be talking about this. And just to be clear, Exxon Mobil appreciates that the risk of climate change is real and that governments around the world should take prudent actions to address these risks. Now, when you look at the outlook and our view of the mix of energies that will make sense for the future, we show here on the left a chart. Note the scale is 100%. And so it's just showing you directly how the mix of fuels is changing over time. And just a couple of observations I'd like to make. First, the probably most dramatic change here is the reduction in coal demand. And this is clearly driven by environmental policies because of the high CO2 emissions when coal is used to make electricity. You see the growth in natural gas, and we'll talk some more about that later. And you also see the growth of other low-carbon energy sources like nuclear, wind and solar, and other renewables. So you might ask, well, with this shift in the mix of energy sources, what's the outlook for the CO2 emissions profile? And this is what we show to the right. And here, again, looking out to 2040, you won't be surprised to see that we show fairly significant reductions in CO2 emissions in the developed world, down about 20%. Again, this is quite an accomplishment for these developed countries. So all of the growth in emissions is in these developing countries. Now, I have to tell you, sometimes I even hesitate showing this chart because people say, well, now we know what the problem is. It's all these developing countries who have higher CO2 emissions. But you have to remember from my earlier charts that these are people who are just trying to improve their standards of living, trying to kind of catch up to the rest of the world. And even by 2040, if you look at the CO2 per person emitted, it's still far lower in the developing countries than it is in the developed world today. And so this is an important perspective. Also, maybe an obvious point as you look at this chart, because the risk of climate change is surely a global issue. And so this chart just reinforces, in my mind, how important it is to address the risk of climate change on a global basis. And this is why agreements such as the COP21 agreement back in Paris in 2015 is really so critical that countries work together to find reasonable ways to address these risks. The next theme is that oil remains the world's primary fuel through 2040. And this next chart here just highlights, when you look at the sectors that we consider, there's really two big sectors where oil is used most prominently, and this is transportation and industrial. And I might add that industrial includes chemicals, and I think I break that out there. You can see the growth in the demand for oil to fuel the production of chemicals around the world. And let me just say one maybe, again, obvious point here, why oil is so significantly important for transportation is in transportation, you obviously need to carry your fuel with you. And so liquid fuels continue to provide performance that's very difficult for any other technology to match. When you think about the energy density and the convenience of liquid fuels, one way to think about this is you can take a 3,000 or 4,000 pound car, and with only 100 pounds of fuel, you can go 70 miles an hour for 400 miles. You can have the AC going. You can have your music system blaring. Then you can stop and refuel in 5 minutes. This is really pretty incredible performance. It's, again, very difficult to replace with alternative technologies. And we'll talk a little bit about that also. Now, when we look at transportation demand, you can see here, again, you get a very different story here depending whether you're looking at light duty or commercial transportation. And just to be clear, starting with the light duty piece, just think cars. These are cars and light pickup trucks. So you see this again fairly, in our industry, remember this is one of our major products, selling fuels for cars, is it's a fairly striking trend to see that it's not only relatively flat, but actually declining over time. Now you're going to see in a minute that I'm going to tell you there's going to be a lot more cars in the world in the future. But those cars are going to be very energy efficient, and these two things kind of offset each other. So all of the growth for transportation fuels is for commercial transportation. This is heavy duty. When you see heavy duty, just think trucks, big trucks, little trucks everywhere in the world, aviation, marine, and rail. And this segment is growing about 50%. And the way to think about this is that commercial transportation correlates much more directly with economic activity. To put it in blunt terms, you make more stuff, you got to move more stuff around. And so you see, again, this is a very important trend in our industry. Now let's drill down a little bit and talk some more about cars. This is a chart that shows you the number of cars in the world, and here you can see that we surely believe there'll be a lot more cars in the world. It's about 80% more cars. You can see it's kind of approaching 2 billion cars in the future. And you can see a couple of trends here. We show in green at the bottom conventional gasoline vehicles. And in the blue, you see the emergence of what we call the full hybrid. Sometimes people say, well, what's our vision of the car of the future? And I have to tell you that the full hybrid to us has a particularly good performance characteristics in terms of meeting the needs of both consumers and government policies. And just to be clear, when we say full hybrid, we mean a car like the Toyota Prius that has on board both a conventional internal combustion engine and uses liquid fuels, but also has the efficiency benefits of the electric drivetrain. You can see at the very top in purple, we do show electric and plug-in cars. And if you look at the growth rate, you can see that the growth rate is actually quite significant. But still, we see them having a modest share, at least by the year 2040. And by the way, this is a classic area where you have a kind of struggle between government policymakers and consumers. And it's not hard to explain this in Texas. Everybody can appreciate the attraction of SUVs and pickup trucks. And this is kind of the consumer trend that we're seeing over time, which actually the share of SUVs and pickup trucks continues to grow in the US, but it's obviously harder to achieve government efficiency targets when you have larger cars. And so this is a kind of ongoing struggle between where policymakers are trying to move the energy world and where consumers want to go from a consumer preference standpoint. So we always have to kind of calibrate this in our outlook. It's a kind of a typical case where we'll say, yeah, that we believe the government policy targets will be achieved, but often maybe later than what policymakers have said is the target year. If you look to the right, another way to look at personal transportation is vehicle miles traveled. We show about a 60% increase in transportation demand. But when you look at the fuel required to meet that demand, again, you see this very flat outlook. And this is because of the fairly dramatic improvement in the energy efficiency for vehicles. And just to put this in perspective, we show the average fuel efficiency going up to 50 miles per gallon. And for most of you, I'm sure you realize that's actually quite an aggressive target. At the same time, it just happens to be the mileage that you can get today with a Toyota Prius. Now, we've talked up to now only about the demand side, so let's say a few things about the supply side. Where is all these liquid fuels and oil going to come from? So on the left, we show the breakdown here mainly by OPEC and non-OPEC sources. And for the sake of time, I won't get into this in too much detail, but just point out that you see the share between OPEC and non-OPEC not really shifting very much over this period. I think a more interesting part of the story is the kind of technology side of this. Where is all this oil coming from? And here, we tried to make this, we broke this down into what we call conventional crude and condensate, which is on the left, shown here for both OPEC and non-OPEC sources. And you can see that for conventional crude is actually relatively flat, even a bit declining trend. So that all of the growth and liquid fuels that the world needs are coming from these new technologies. Now, we label it tight oil. I think people probably know it more as shale oil, which is growing quite significantly. A lot of this coming from North America in the early years of the outlook. NGLs, this is natural gas liquids. So this is surely part of the shale gas story. As we see an expansion in shale gas, we see an expansion in natural gas liquids. Deep water. We continue to develop new technologies that allow us to develop oil and to produce resources in ever more challenging areas. And you know, I have to say, even working in the business, I'm always still amazed at what can be done with deep water. You know, today, with today's technology, we can go out and drill in water that's 2 miles deep, go down to the bottom of the ocean floor, drill a hole, go down a couple of miles, take a right turn, go 5 more miles, and identify a pocket of oil. It's really pretty incredible what can be done. And a lot of this was unimaginable 10 or 20 years ago. We have oil sands as we deploy new technologies to produce oil sands in places like Canada, although there's other oil sands resources around the world. Biofuels, we do show some growth in biofuels. This is an area we're all doing a lot of research, trying to find more economic sources for biofuels. Most of what's in our outlook here is driven, frankly, by government mandates. But again, it's an area to watch, and it's an area we're all working very hard to develop new technologies. One last thing I want to say about oil here, because a lot of people don't always appreciate this, is that you have to continue to invest just to hold supplies steady. And just to make this point, if you tomorrow stop making investments in oil, you would see a decline by the year 2040. You would lose 85% of today's supply. And this is just following the natural decline curves with production. And so, as you can see to the right, we have to make huge investments, not only to kind of replace that decline, but also to meet the growing needs for oil around the world. All right, one last thing, I guess, on oil, just global trade. Trade has always been hugely important for the energy industry. Where we find the oil and where we need the oil is often different places, and so keeping world oil markets and trade routes open is critically important. I've tried to use a very simple scale here. You can see that red means a country is importing the oil, and green means they're exporting. And just a couple of points here. First, you can see North America is really quite a dramatic story here as we've gone from being a significant oil importer to becoming a significant oil exporter. And of course, this is enabled by shale oil technology as well as the development of other technologies across the board. Otherwise, you see the trade patterns remain relatively stable. You see that Europe and Asia Pacific are the main importing regions, and note the particularly strong growth in Asia Pacific. And this is, of course, because of their faster economic expansion rates there, and that the Middle East and Russia Caspian remain the main exporters. And by the way, I sometimes hesitate even choosing red and green, which maybe overstate whether it's a good or bad thing to be an exporter or an importer. Most countries wouldn't hesitate to say they'd rather be an exporter. But the fact is, as long as everyone has access to affordable energy and world trade remains open and diverse, economies everywhere can thrive. And surely this is where we are today with the affordability of energy and the great diversity of energy sources available to consumers everywhere. All right, the next theme is natural gas. I had mentioned earlier that natural gas grows more than any other energy source. Now, of course, natural gas has been around a long time. It's a very versatile fuel. It's used kind of across the board in almost every sector. Natural gas is used one way or another. It also has much lower CO2 emissions per unit of energy, particularly when you make electricity. It's about 50 to 60% lower CO2 emissions. So from a sustainability and environmental perspective, it's very attractive. And it's also very easy to use. We have technologies that continue to get better, but we have lots of existing technologies to use natural gas. Now, for the sake of time, I'm just going to focus on one sector for natural gas, and this is electricity. Electricity demand continues to surge as the world economy continues to expand. Everybody appreciates electricity. It's such a convenient, clean source of energy. And when people plug their cell phone chargers into the wall, nobody really has to think too much about where all that energy comes from. But when you develop an energy outlook, it's really critical to kind of go behind the scenes and look at what sources of energy are going to make the most sense to generate all this electricity. You can see in places like China already the total electricity demand has already surpassed that of the United States. So to the right, we show here, again, looking at our country-by-country buildup, what we see as the mix of fuels will make sense for the future. And again, I'll just point out a few highlights here. You notice coal is, of course, historically been the most significant source of generating electricity. And you see the outlook for coal, again, due to environmental pressures, is relatively flat. But please notice, it also doesn't go away. The world is going to continue to use coal, mainly because of its affordability, and particularly in developing countries. You see natural gas here. This is where natural gas really comes into its own because it's affordable, it's highly abundant, as we've unlocked all of these new resources of natural gas. There's many, many countries that embrace the use of natural gas as a fuel, particularly to make electricity. It's very flexible. Nuclear, we show nuclear almost doubling over this period. Nuclear is kind of interesting. If ever there's a topic you have to address on a country-by-country basis, it's nuclear. I always say if engineers ran the world, you'd probably see a lot more nuclear power, although I've been told they will not let us run the world. And so it's a little more complicated than that. And just as an example, look at the countries of France and Germany, where France is highly dependent on nuclear power, and it's worked out very well for them. And the people of Germany have said they don't want any nuclear power in the future. And so it's what I'll call the social overlays that we have to consider on a country-by-country basis. And then, of course, wind and solar, which are growing faster than any other sources. And, of course, a lot of that is supported by government policies and subsidies that have supported wind and solar and other renewables. And we see those policies continuing, and so we see those continuing to expand. Now, I promise not to go through this in any detail. I know there's a lot of data here, but I just want to point out again, as you look at this on a regional basis, when you look at the fuels that make sense for any given region, they really can be quite different depending on what country you're looking at. I'll just point out two of them. In the US, here you see, because of environmental pressures, a fairly significant reduction in coal usage over time. And you see that the growth is really with natural gas and renewables. But contrast that with China, where you see not only continued use of coal, but actually an expansion in the use of coal, but also very aggressive expansion of renewables as well as for natural gas. On the supply side for natural gas, you won't be surprised to hear that to meet the needs of the natural gas growth, which is about 45% increase in demand, again, more than any other fuel for the future, natural gas is growing from an absolute standpoint, that a lot of that growth is coming from unconventionals. And of course, this has been dominant in North America, but over time, we do believe that unconventional gas will begin to expand in other places around the world. And when you look at how that gas is delivered, we show here in red at the bottom net local production or pipeline gas. The yellow above that is cross-border or international pipelines. And then lastly, LNG or liquefied natural gas. Liquefied natural gas is a big business opportunity for us, so it's an area we're very interested in. And you see the expansion in world trade of LNG by a factor of about 2.5 over this period. The LNG is something the U.S. hasn't used too much in the past, but surely with all of the abundant natural gas resources we have now, we're certainly well situated to become a significant LNG exporter. Let's look at world trade also for natural gas. And here, using the same codes, it's kind of interesting that the profile or the trends are very much the same as with oil. You see, again, North America going from being a net importer to a net exporter over time. And then the same trends with Europe and Asia Pacific being significant importers, both of them growing in terms of their needs for added imports, and the other significant exporters remaining Russia, Caspian, and the Middle East. Now, my last thing is technology. And of course, technology, and this is true for any industry, has the greatest potential to improve the outlook, and it also introduces the greatest uncertainty to any kind of future forecast. And I've racked up some of these numbers for you already. We've talked about cars and light bulbs. I know light bulbs are very controversial. We actually save a lot of energy with the new light bulbs. No one seems to like them, but that's a whole nother issue. If you look at the CO2 used per unit of energy is going down as we move to cleaner and lower carbon fuels. I also mentioned that when you look at the energy required to produce a unit of GDP is going down quite significantly. And when you consider both of those, you see the CO2 emissions per unit of GDP is going down by 45% over this time. And of course, this is a global roll-up, so we're looking at the benefits of technology and efficiencies across every sector in the economy and in sources for energy. Now, Exxon Mobil is doing a lot of research, as are a lot of people in the world of energy. You know, there's just huge incentives to pursue breakthroughs in energy technologies because energy is such a huge part of the world economy. We're doing a lot of work in biofuels, carbon capture, and chemicals, lubricants. And I just want to highlight one area that's very exciting for us is carbon capture using carbonate fuel cells. And just by reference here, when you generate power with a gas power turbine, of course, you generate electricity and get the exhaust with the CO2, which is normally vented to the atmosphere. And what we're doing with these fuel cells is we're putting in this carbonate fuel cell, and we use as a feed to that fuel cell the exhaust from the natural gas turbine. We feed in some additional methane on the other side of the fuel cell, and from that, we generate more electricity and heat, and in the process, actually concentrate the CO2, which then can be put underground for storage. And one of the reasons this is so exciting is we're actually making more power. You may know that with conventional carbon capture technology, you have what's called parasitic load, which you actually need more power to capture the carbon, so you reduce the output of the power plant. By using fuel cells, we actually not only capture the carbon, but maintain the same energy efficiency for power generation. Now I'm going to close with just one slide here, which kind of, again, wraps up the total outlook. This is looking to the year 2040. The size of the bar is the total amount of energy supplied by that form of fuel in the year 2040. The dotted line, by reference, shows where we are in the base year of 2015. The percent number at the top is the average growth rate over that period. And I want to make just a few observations. First, you can see here where oil does remain in the #1 position over this period, again, driven by its uniquely attractive properties for transportation. You can see how natural gas moves into the #2 position, moving ahead of coal as the second most important fuel. You can also see, because of the biggest difference between the dotted line and the top line, that in absolute growth terms, this is the most important fuel in terms of providing the net absolute energy for the future. Coal, you can see, is basically flat over the outlook. Nuclear, again, you can see it almost doubling here over this period. And then you have the last comment I want to make is, please notice the growth rate for solar, wind, and biofuels. It has the highest growth rate. So everything you're reading about wind and solar growing at these fast rates, it's absolutely true. But you have to also remember they're starting from a very low base. And so by the year 2040, they still meet about only 4% of the world's energy needs. And the last overlay I want to present on this chart is just another reminder about all the action in the developing countries. And here you can see, again, using our red-blue coding here, you can see the huge importance of what's happening in the developing world and how important it is looking out to the year 2040 in terms of the overall energy picture. So that wraps up my presentation. I know that's kind of a rapid kind of run through the energy outlook, but I assure you there's lots of information available. Like everyone, we have this posted on our website. You can download the brochures. I have a couple with me here. Some people still like to look at the hard copies, and we have those available if you'd like to see that. And so I encourage you, or to send your students if they want to learn more about energy. We publish all the data here and try to be as transparent as we can. And this is exactly the same data that we use to develop all of our own internal business plans. So with that, I think I can open it up now for questions.
I've got a quick one here. I would assume that government policies around the world regarding carbon pricing would impact that relative mix and demand. What is baked into your assumptions and forecasts, and how sensitive is that to the total and to the forecast?
Yeah, great question. And when we rigorously have to address this, and again, you have to do this on a country-by-country basis. And I would say I start by saying that we use what we call a proxy cost of carbon, which is kind of our view of how much governments are willing to spend from a policy standpoint to kind of put pressure on the amount of energy that's used and the types of energies that are used. And for instance, in developed countries, we assume that countries would be willing to pay up to $80 per ton of carbon to mitigate carbon emissions. We also look sector by sector. For instance, in the automotive industry, policymakers do this quite directly by setting CAFE standards, for instance, in the US. And so all of that is baked into the outlook. It's one of the reasons why you see the mix towards cleaner fuels, because we have very clear and rigorous treatment of government policies. Although, again, it has to be done on a country-by-country basis. So that's definitely baked into the outlook.
Is there a sensitivity? I mean, if governments don't do that?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to be clear, if a government says they're going to do X by the year Y, that doesn't mean that's what goes into our outlook. We have to step back. A classic case is, the Japanese came out several years ago and said, after Fukushima, obviously, that they were done with nuclear. So we had to say, okay, well, do we believe that? Do we believe the Japanese are going to walk away from nuclear? We did not. We felt certain they would come back. The Germans have said they're going to walk away from nuclear. Our outlook says we believe they can afford to do that. And so now, can it be different? Could things turn out differently? Absolutely. So we always take what we call our 50-50 kind of best estimate of what we think is actually going to happen. I don't know what the protocol is. The people at the mic, I think, have priority. Yes.
So Exxon is also, and I know the focus is on energy, but let me drive the other end of the piece of this. You are also a large water manager. For every barrel of oil coming up, it's bringing anywhere from 4 to 8, all the way over to the refineries. In your energy outlook, especially domestically, but with your global perspective, where is Exxon seeing over the next 20 years, especially the next 5 years, where is water management, where is water technology, where does all of that fit into your scope of both your R&D side, but also, in a sense, in the field implementation?
Yeah, and of course I can answer this in a lot of ways. From our operational perspective, of course, we're very careful about the way we manage water and build that into our business plans. But when you ask narrowly how we work it into the energy outlook, this is very much a local consideration depending on where we break down our supply side of our outlook. It really has to be done on a region by region basis, even within the U.S. I would say in general in the U.S. the trend is towards more natural gas and less coal, and so that would suggest that we have a lot less water need in the U.S. just because so much more water is used in the power generation side of the energy picture. And when you move from coal to natural gas, you use a hugely lower amount of water. So I would say the overall water demands are lower in the outlook.
I have a question regarding your outlook for efficiency gains, over time. So can you tell us a little bit about what was your baseline and how do you actually try to predict increases in efficiency at, different, in different sectors of the economy, different parts of the world?
Yeah, we do it, I would say, sector by sector, technology by technology. For instance, we look at cement manufacture. What is the energy use today? What are the new technologies? How does that get better? Steel manufacturing, we show substantial reductions in the amount of energy used per ton of steel produced. In cars, we look at car technology, chemicals technology, residential technologies, which are also getting much more efficient over time. So we don't do any kind of top-level adjustments. It's all bottom-up, and you really have to do it technology by technology.
Thank you.
I eyeballed your plot of crude and condensate expectation until 2040, and in it, the expectation for tight oil, at least, was relatively small compared to conventional. And with respect to the future reserves, which have to do with how much CO2 will eventually go in, has the revolution in long horizontal wells and massive fracturing changed your idea about the total reserves very much?
The answer is yes. Well, one of the great benefits of doing this every year is you get to update your assumptions every year. And I would say that it's been incredible over the past year how much more aggressive we've been able to be, exactly to your point, as the ability, the access to more reserves, cheaper reserves, more efficient drilling, and so we definitely build that in. At the same time, the unconventional oil has to compete in the world market against other suppliers, and so we have to consider all that, and we integrate all of that to come up with our global outlook. I mean, the reality is now, if you look at the world resources someone mentioned this morning, I think our number is 150 years. When you look at the amount of energy or oil available today, at today's consumption rate, people often ask, well, how much oil is around? And the answer is we have 150 years of supply. Now, the interesting part of that story is the number keeps growing. You'd think, well, gee, we use a lot of energy every year. It must be going down. But because of technology and access to new resources, that number has dramatically increased to 150 years today. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that liquefied natural gas is going to grow substantially. Could you be a little bit more finer grain? What fraction is methane? What fraction is butane? Is some of the liquefied natural gas created by reformation? In other words, what do you see is how is the liquefied natural gas actually going to play a more significant role?
Is your question about unconventional natural gas?
The question is about what the chemical composition of the gas is going to be, and is reformation being used in part of that?
Yes. And so as you look around at unconventional gas production, in every region, and sometimes even within regions, you get a fairly dramatic shift sometimes in the amount of natural gas liquids. This is ethane, propane, that is co-produced with the gas. And for instance, in the Northeast, you get much higher levels of natural gas liquids. And so we surely build that in, again, even within sub-regions as the outlook, as we kind of add it all up. And so it's quite a wide range. And I get a sign that says end of Q&A. So I think that means I'm done. Is that right? Thank you for your attention, and I'll be around all night. If you have any questions, you know who I am. Thank you.